This episode is brought to you by Mailtrap. More on them later.
Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron.
So I was writing unit tests the other day for an external library. Well, not for an external library, but it was being called inside of this
Mhm.
code and I was injecting it. And I think I've complained about this before. That sometimes when you want to mock things out and they're like a final class, and you're just like, why? That makes it so much more difficult to mock the stuff correctly and to
Right.
modify it. Well, I ran into a different challenge too, which was mocking out this SDK that they had created where then there was a property and a method named the same thing. And
Oh,
so it was impossible really, as far as I knew, to mock out that properties access and also mock out the method. And it
yeah.
turns out the reason why they did that is because both of those were done with magic methods. So there
Ooh.
is a underscore underscore call for the method name,
Yep.
and there's the underscore underscore get for the property value. And really, then because so many other things were used uh, magically as well, it was really difficult just to mock out the get or set because then you'd have to mock out every single call
Right.
of get and all that stuff. So I just got me thinking, like, should we even be using these magic methods and properties?
Are you trying to ban magic? Is that what's happening right now here, Aaron? You just don't enjoy the satisfaction. Like, well, it's interesting because that it's kind of a from a developer experience, it's kind of nice. But on the other hand, from testing and maybe even a maintenance experience, like, this is this is definitely not nice. But what you were talking about is a third party client library, like in
Sure.
Laravel itself, right? Like eloquent models, right?
Oh yeah.
We have something similar. Maybe not the weird combination of magic properties and methods, but certainly properties. What are your thoughts on those? Do you get the same vibe, or is that different?
It's both the same and different, right? So I would disagree because that's just what I do, I guess. With you saying that the developer, it's a good developer experience or whatever. Having these magic properties and methods, I think it's
Hmm.
actually a worse developer experience unless you know exactly what is the magic. So if you are trying to look at something that has all the methods defined,
Yeah. Okay.
all the protected or all the public methods, all the public properties, it's easy to figure out what's there. But if
Yeah.
you're like in Eloquent and you're not using something like IDE Helper, which
Mm,
puts all the annotations and stuff,
right.
how do you actually know what names of each of the properties are? Well, you have to then go one step further and look in the database, I guess,
Right.
because there's no properties on the model that you can be like, oh, what was the name of that? Was it completed at or date completed? I don't remember which one.
This is a good point because it's like the tooling you mentioned IDE helper. There's also in PHP Stormland, there's that Laravel IDEA plugin
Hmm.
that will introspect some of these things for you, even without doc blocks. Um, it can make the experience almost as if they were declared properties, right? Like from the perspective of your IDE or code editor autocomplete, you can hit arrow and see a list of what they are. You could start typing, like in your example, you could start COM and you could see, oh, it is completed at. So maybe that's a distinguisher here too, is like, is there tooling to support the authoring experience with these magic properties? Because I like using them in Eloquent. Like, I mean, what would be the alternative? Like, it would feel weird to me to come into a project where somebody had actually declared all those properties on the the model class.
Yeah, I agree that that would be weird and Eloquent in Laravel land,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean that we can't look at some of our things and say it makes sense in this situation, but not others. So, for
Right.
example, I'm fine with them being on Eloquent, but I don't necessarily like the dynamic facades. For example,
Hmm.
it's hard to know what exactly is there unless you have tooling. And like I know I'm getting nitpicky here, but I think there's a difference between tooling where it's just a language can understand itself
Hmm.
and I'm going to call it annotative tooling, which
Okay.
is like IDE helper and that Laravel IDE plugin where it knows something that isn't necessarily in the code.
Right.
It's only after processing the code that it can understand that. So
Yeah.
it's not really like a static analysis thing per se. I know
Right.
we're kind of like bumping up against a lot of different things here, but I think for certain things it's okay. And on other things, it makes it much more difficult.
Well, let me give an example because I think we're on the same page. Using IDE helper model properties, great. Like we use it all over the place.
Yeah.
But one we don't use, which is actually quite similar, is request. Right? When you have a request
Mhm.
coming into a controller, you could do request arrow property, right? Or even request a form request. The same thing. It's a dynamic access to a property that's there, but there isn't anything like IDE helper, at least not that I've seen, that will type those things for you. And some of the net is because it could actually be dynamic. Like it's not as static as like a table in a database
Right.
backing this model.
Well, the other thing is I don't know if I can't remember off the top of my head, but let's just say the form request has is wrapped around something internally which has like this input, and that's how
Hmm.
you get stuff. Well, what if you have a property in your form field called input? You know,
Okay.
then
Right.
what happened when you call this input? Is it the actual input
Hmm.
underlying thing, or is it your property? I would
Yeah.
hope it's the underlying thing, but then how do you get your property? They're gonna have to do something else anyway. So there's gonna be some sort of overlaps here.
Yeah, I would just say don't name a field input. That's just bad. But I get your point. Like there's going to be some potential for overlap with a dynamically accessed property on a class as big as the request object,
Mhm.
right? Um, it is a little bit of a tangent, but I want to give you a chance to like disagree with me or something. But remember, there was a project recently where I was toying with an accessor on a form request that was like strongly typed where it would like, because validation had happened, right? We always validate in our form request. So we know these fields, for example, are present and they're a string and they're maybe this is an array of ints or things like that. So like there's a guaranteed contract that if the request makes its way into the controller, all of those properties were true. So I was using like these crazy doc blocks with array shapes where you could actually name all of the keys. And like, did you like that, Aaron? What was your thought on that? I was just playing around.
I can see the point.
Yeah.
I just didn't I I just didn't see the value of all the work.
Yeah.
So maybe it helped you with one or two things,
Hmm.
but in general, all that work to create those typings, which I'm a huge fan of types,
Right.
like parameters and all the different things.
Yeah.
But like when you're actually putting it in like doc blocks only for this other piece of code, which I mean, you already have a good idea what that is and how those should work, as
Yeah.
well as like that wasn't useful. That was I think on the rules.
Hmm.
Well, we don't use the rules. Like we don't consume the rules, so why would we care what the shape is?
Right. Yeah. Well, this was just one more little nuance on this because I think it does kind of line up with this topic. The request object in Laravel has some typed accessors, right? So you can say arrow Boolean and then give it a request property name, and it will give you back a Boolean, right? Everything that comes in an HTTP request is a string, but there were some typed helpers. These typed helpers did not exist on the form request, right? And so that, or I take that back. A form request is a request, but they didn't exist on the validated specific accessor for the
Right.
form request, which we always like to use just as like a sanity check. We're only going to access stuff that's been validated. We couldn't do that. So I was just playing around with it. And I wasn't convinced either. I was just having fun. And, maybe this is an opportunity for some tooling. If there was something like an IDE helper that could look at your rules and create like a typed object that comes out. Like I know there are packages that do this. Um, I think Spotsy makes like a DTO package, Laravel data or something where you can more explicitly define this. I haven't actually tried that. I looked at it and there's some things about it that I give me pause. But I don't know. Like I think what you were landed on is it feels brittle, right? Like every time I change a rule, and I have to remember to go change this doc block, which is true of models. If you have a migration, you got to update your doc block, but there's a tool that does it for you. Whereas if you're doing it
Yeah.
manually, it just feels not as good.
Yeah. So I think there are some places for the magic methods and properties and stuff, but it usually seems that there has to be additional tooling to make that visible to someone who isn't you.
Yes.
And so I don't necessarily like that. I mean, many times in my career, I had reached for that, especially when I thought I was more clever.
Mm,
And that's again a rule we always bring up was like if you
yeah.
think you're being clever, you're probably not.
It'll never come back to bite you, I'm sure. This episode is sponsored by Mailtrap, an email delivery platform that developers love. An email sending solution with industry best analytics, SMTP, and email API, SDKs for major programming languages, and 24/7 human support. Try for free at mailtrap.io.
There are many things that indicate to me that I'm getting old, and I've mentioned them a few times, I think, on the podcast. But one of them that's just recently happened is I'm interested in silverware now.
Okay, okay, say more about that.
I have a set of silverware I bought,
Mhm.
I don't know, like 2 decades ago, and they work perfectly fine. But recently I've been looking on like Etsy at like
Oh boy.
silverware, and I'm just like, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a heavy butter knife?" Like, well, I don't ever sit down at my table and then weigh my butter knife and then, "Oh, this is so nice." Like, I grab it from the drawer, wipe something on something, and throw it like in the sink. Like, I would
Yeah, but
break all these silverwares, I think.
no, you don't do that because you don't have something to, like, really savor. If you had that nice set, then you would. It would
Oh.
be more of an event every time you butter your bread or whatever it is you do with a knife.
Let's be honest, just like Joel said, you're probably listening to this at 1.5 or 2 times speed, maybe 2 or 3 in a row. But there is a show.nocompromises.io page, right?
We'd really appreciate it if you share the show with others because maybe you really enjoyed it, or maybe out of spite because you know somebody will disagree with our topic.